Good evening, and welcome back to the TRM Parent Parsha series, Parsha Toldot. So tonight we're going to go back to our original framework that we've been engaging in for the last couple of weeks. We mixed it up last week, but we'll go back to its original pattern for this week, which is a parenting tip on the go, a hopefully salient and related Devar Torah that is related to the parenting tip, but can also be used at your Shabbat table, and then a few Parsha dessert ideas for how to bring some of the Parshat ideas home to your Shabbat table. On Monday evening, I had the honor and privilege of being able to speak to a relatively large group of guidance counselors, like school psychologists, school counselors, through the umbrella organization Prisma. And we were talking about lots of different things related to students. And one of the things that I was able to share with them was something interesting that I learned I think it was the end of last week, on an interesting podcast. It's produced by the American Psychological Association, and the interview was with someone named Emma Adams, Dr. Emma Adams, and she's a professor, I think, at Northwestern, and she was part of a study that looked at anxiety, and I think it also looked at depression rates, but I think mostly was looking at stress levels as it related to what's considered Gen Z, which is teenagers. Let's add some middle schoolers to that mix, and then young adults as well, and compared it pre-lockdown and post-lockdown, and trying to understand, are people more stressed? And if I asked adults, I think most adults would say yes, we are more stressed, and we're more stressed about a variety of different things. And one of the things that this particular study found was that, in addition, it was called the Harris study, in addition to parents and adults being more stressed, so young adults who are coming out of college and trying to find jobs, they are also way more stressed. But what was so fascinating, and really, I think, confirming for something that I've been thinking about in my own practice and what I'm seeing anecdotally, is that teenagers and middle school kids, their stress level actually did not go up pre-lockdown and post-lockdown. Their stress level stayed the same. But what did shift and change were the things that stressed them out. And one of the things that dramatically went down in terms of their stress level during the COVID lockdown period was school-related stressors. And that one of the things we found is that school-related stressors and school in general inhibits kids' natural sleep patterns. And when kids aren't sleeping properly, and when we say that teenagers aren't sleeping properly, one of the things that's kind of a wonky thing is that teenagers have a naturally different sleep-wake pattern than adults. It's usually in conflict with adults. So teenagers, to no surprise, like to go to bed late and wake up late. And that's not really enabled by a school lifestyle, because what we actually want them to do is go to bed a little bit earlier because they have to wake up for school earlier. And what the lockdown allowed for kids to do, and the same thing to some degree with some amount of virtual school, is it actually allowed them to go more naturally towards their sleep circadian rhythm. They were getting more sleep. School was less stressful. And so a lot of factors in that nature decrease, and I think it's something to be paying attention to. And I think that administrators, teachers actually should be really paying attention to that. And it's probably why we're seeing a tremendous amount of stress amongst our teenagers currently, in terms of going back to school and back to the load and level of work intensity, and the pressure that teachers are feeling in terms of having to make up for a chunk of time of school that was missing. So I think that's really critical. But one of the things that they did find, interestingly also, in other words, the opposite of that, was that stress related to families increased, in terms of the fact that, this was particularly noticing that amongst families who have more strife, more stressors, that, the being home with parents, and maybe parents who they're in conflict with, or siblings who they're in conflict with, or parents who are very stressed out. So those were factors and variables that cause their stress levels to rise, and the two kind of equaled themselves out. So you had basically like this same stress level, but the variables were different. And it got me thinking a little bit about, it's something that's been on my mind, but it's something I really was thinking about in particular this week, and thinking about it in terms of the ideas that, like, we all parent in a very specific way. And I think if we're really honest with ourselves, I think at least for me, one of the biggest challenges that I face when I'm parenting is to really recognize when I'm constantly harping on the same kid, when I'm constantly saying to the same kid over and over again, I really wish you wouldn't do that. Could you stop doing that? I feel like you're, like, are you having a hard time right now? Where it feels like I'm more critical of that one kid than I am of other kids. And sometimes that has to do with how we as a parent and a person relate to that specific kid. The idea, the kid being further from my tree or closer to my tree, the kid who's more like me versus the kid who's less like me. The kid who, if you're a parent who loves reading and you have a kid who loves reading, so the two of you kind of mesh together. If you're a kid you have a kid who loves to talk and you're a parent who loves to talk, so you might also mesh together. And sometimes those things can kind of shift up and change, and it changes with each kid, but it can also change in your family dynamic. And if you notice that you're constantly rewarding one kid and the other kid's constantly and another kid is recognizing that one kid's getting rewarded and they're trying to insert themselves, but they insert themselves in a way that actually has the reverse effect. And I think taking a pause to look at all the different variables and dynamics that are going on in people's homes and trying to think about how we give feedback to our kids, first of all, that feels constructive, but that feels very loving. And I think one quick takeaway, obviously this could be a much larger discussion, and a much larger idea that would need fleshed out and people would want to talk about and think about. But I think two takeaway pieces that I've been trying to focus on this week, at least, are how do I remind myself to be critical of the action and not the child, and really being mindful of the words that I use. Like, when you did that, that was the little bit, that made me sad. You are such a wonderful, sweet child. And that, it felt like that wasn't really coming from the way that you are, or you seem to be very frustrated because you usually aren't like this. So please tell me what's happening for you right now. Sometimes our kids are available to have those higher level discussions. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes we just have to be able to look at our kid and, instead of being like, can you please stop doing that? Recognize where they're up to and say, can I give you a hug right now? It looks like you need a hug. And then we can always go back later and say, it looked like you were having a hard time in that moment. Can we talk about it? I think this idea of really conveying to our children that we deeply love them, and we think that we value them, and when we create that energy, when we create that environment where they feel loved, I think they're much more available to the feedback, because it doesn't feel like it's a personal attack, and it feels like we're in it with them in a really warm, positive way, but also able to say, I really wish you wouldn't have done that. That was a little bit disappointing. I think we can try to do better next time. But I also think the other piece of this, which is like a little bit of a flip piece, is really looking for opportunities to praise our children. And I think that, like, sometimes it requires all of us to pause and be like, what happened today, right? So when a kid is nice to another sibling, and we've been trying to remind that kid, oh, maybe could you just pause and just, like, work from kindness, right? And when we see like a wonderful exchange, I think sometimes our gut is to just keep moving because, like, they're doing the thing we expect them to do. But I think what we really want to be thinking about is, how can we pause and be like, wow, that was like such a nice moment. Or even just when we're tucking our kids into bed at night, I really noticed that you were trying so hard to play with your sibling, and that, like, I was really proud of you. I know that that's sometimes really hard, and I noticed it, and we're really proud of you. And thank you for creating that in our home. I think really just trying to pause and be intentional with our parenting, both in feedback when it's critical, but also really looking for opportunities to praise and love. And really separating the action from the child. And I think one of the things that we can look to our avot for almost everything, but I think we see this in particular in this week's Parsha as like something that Yitzchak was really able to do. And I think that, again, without getting into the mess of how are we critical of the avot and imahot, are we supposed to be, are they just misunderstood characters? And without getting into the trenches of that, I think it's fair to say that Rivka very much struggled with that. And I think she even struggled with it in utero, in terms of this identification that she had two very different worlds experienced in her stomach. And she was somehow in tune with the fact that one was working for her and one was feeling a little bit different than her. And I think, it's hard to I've been pregnant with twins. I don't know that I would be able to articulate which twin is doing what, but I think that potentially one of the reasons that the Torah is maybe bringing that to light is that right from the beginning, there's a recognition for Rivka that she's having a hard time connecting with one of the twins more than the other. And I think it's something that pains her, and we see it kind of paining her, and she seems to be struggling with it. And yes, we can talk about it from the perspective that Rivka had she had some type of nivu'ah that she knew what needed to happen, and Yitzchak wasn't necessarily going to. She was worried that Yitzchak wouldn't be able to carry that through. But I definitely think we see that Yitzchak very much was able to connect to both of his children, and despite the fact that maybe he didn't necessarily agree with all of the behaviors that Esav was engaging in. Nevertheless, their relationship was one in which Esav felt a deep sense of love from Yitzchak, and because of that, they were able to maintain a connection. And one of the things that Rabbi Amnon Bazak points out, and he quotes the Midrash Haggadah on Bereshit, for some reason I really couldn't find it, and instead of citing something that looks a little bit different, I challenge everybody to try to go find this. I have the English of it, but I couldn't find it in the Hebrew text, is that we see later on that there's a clear articulation that Yitzchak and Rivka were disappointed about the choices that Esav made in terms of who he chose to marry. And we also see, though, that Esav saw this, he integrated it, and he saw that Yitzchak gave a bracha to Yaakov, and he somehow made this connection for himself that it definitely had to do with the fact that Yaakov was choosing or was agreeing to marry in a way that would continue the legacy, and he had chosen otherwise. Vayishma Yaakov el Aviv. Yaakov listened to his parents. V'yalech Padan Aram, and he went to Padan Aram. Vayar Esav, and in that moment, it seems that Esav was available to some degree, that his actions also were contributing to part of the dynamic that was going on. And without getting into this discussion of, are children always required to do exactly what their parents want from them and fulfill the dreams that they have for them? But I think that there is an idea that parents can have expectations, and that's reasonable, and they are people independent of their children and have dreams for their children and values that they hope that they'll continue. Esav sees that this is very upsetting to his father. And because of that, the next pasuk says, Esav went to Ishmael, and he chooses for his third wife a very different choice. And I think his choosing in Ishmael is really a reaching out to his father to say, I am choosing to be part of this family, the family of Abraham. And so maybe I didn't choose somebody from Padan Aram. Maybe I didn't choose Leah, who maybe, the Midrashim talk about this idea that Yaakov was supposed to marry Rachel and Esau was supposed to marry Leah. And that was why Leah's eyes were red from crying. But I think that this does speak to the fact that Esav is very much trying to reconnect himself. And what the Midrash Haggadah points out is that it is that the reason that Esav was able to make this initiation and try to return and reconnect really had to do with the fact that he felt a deep sense of love from Yitzchak. And then if he didn't feel that love for Yitzchak, and if it felt so acrimonious and so filled with animosity, he would have just been more likely to be like, oh, so nobody likes me anyways. Like, what do I care? What do I even need to listen to these people? That relationships, the depth of a relationship, feeling loved, feeling heard, allows us to sometimes maybe have different moments, different disappointments, different expectations that were failed, but also allows us to really convey to our children our values, because they don't feel judged as a person. It feels like they're loved, but it's their behaviors that maybe we're having a judgment on, and that's okay. That's our job as parents, to help our children develop into, they're not born knowing how to behave and engage in the world with perfect, none of us know perfect, but like with the right necessarily deeds and actions all the time, and we're here to help them do that, but we want to do it from a venue of feeling love and warmth. I think there's a hard conversation to necessarily have at the table, but things to, particularly with younger kids, but I think some things to, I guess, pop around in your own brain that were questions that I was thinking about is, do you think it was hard for Esav that his mother seemed to be on Yaakov's side, right? We know that kids think about these things all the time. Oh, you love that kid more than me, or you're always disagreeing with me and you always agree with that kid. And I think it's okay to let our kids kind of like explore that conversation. Sometimes they're thinking it anyways, so we're not giving them an idea. We're just giving them the platform to be able to share that, like, oh, I don't feel that way, but I get how you feel that way sometimes. times, and I'm sorry you feel that way. That's so validating for our kids. What happens when we do something that disappoints someone else? We're going to disappoint people in this world. When do we decide that, we shouldn't be disappointing somebody else? And maybe sometimes we say, okay, you know what, I'm doing what I think is right for me or right for my family or right in Torah and halacha, and that might disappoint other people, and that's okay. And I'm going to be okay, and they're going to be okay. And this idea that disappointment doesn't break the world. Is it important to always make other people happy? Is it okay for people to tell us that they disappointed us and still love us? This idea that we can fight well, right? It's such an important idea for our children to see. We can disagree, we can be disappointed, we can wish something happened differently, but still love the people around us in a very deep, meaningful, rich way. What could Yaakov and Esav have done differently between themselves, right? Starting a conversation around siblings. What could Yitzchak and Rivka have done differently? Really starting to provoke and ask questions about their relationship. And as much as it was so filled with a deep sense of love, sometimes it seems like they had a hard time getting themselves on the same page around really important, critical issues. And, maybe that's not a question for the Shabbos table. Maybe it's a question for after the Shabbos table when you're just sitting with your spouse and you're able to think about how we parent and how we co-parent. So just some thoughts to leave you with that I wanted to share. Parsha treats for this week. The one that everybody talks about is making lentil soup. It's the best one. We love it. Here's the thing. In my house, when I mentioned the possibility of having lentil soup for Friday night, there was a very clear revolt. One kid actually said to me, "You can make it, but we will not eat it." And I was like, okay. So I actually made lentil soup tonight. So it's like an ongoing week process, but we will be having chicken soup in our house. 2 years ago, I made different types of lentil cupcakes. Well, one was cupcakes, and those were the red for the lentil soup with like the little brown pots on top. And the other ones were like little tins that I filled with like red jelly beans and red hearts and red licorice. And I put like those little tops on them. I saw somebody else had done a cupcake that just had like red chocolate lentils and put like a little pot on top. I think you could also, I loved this idea in the corner because you could buy it. It's always better to buy. So they bought black and white cookies, and they decorated the pink and red ones as Esav, and the black and white ones as Yitzchak. And you can kind of spice it up how you need to, depending on your own hashkafic views about what people's kippas and payas and all sorts of things look like. And the same thing in the corner in terms of red and Yaakov. So the other thing that I loved that somebody just gave to me I read it online just right before, and I actually just made these. Surprise, that's what I'm probably going to be posting. I did the red velvet surprise. So the idea that what they did like a Shabbos full of red things for Esav, that it was a surprise all of a sudden when he came out full of hair. And so the kids were like busy guessing what it could possibly be that I was making as I was like baking it, putting it together, like, okay, wait, is it this? Is it that? Is it this? And then when they saw it and I said, oh, well, it's a red velvet. And all the kids were like, it's red. It's because he was red. And I was like, bingo. So anyways, you can kind of come up with your own ideas or think about different ways that you would want to you could also even do like a very fun Shabbos morning, like a big soup pot, like Esav's, Yaakov is busy making his pot and all the things you're going to put into your pot. And so I think there's like a fun idea to be had there as well. So I look forward to seeing what all the different people are making and what they came up with during Shabbos, before Shabbos, after Shabbos, and Shabbat Shalom, and keep the feedback coming. Thank you.